Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
There's no denying it. The world is full of toxic chemicals that are detrimental to our health. Is there a way to protect ourselves? Mission Evolution Radio TV show is coming to you around the world on the X Zone Broadcast Network, xzbn.net. With us this hour to discuss protecting our health in a chemical world is Dr. Aly Cohen. Dr. Cohen is triple board certified in rheumatology, internal medicine, and integrative medicine, as well as an environmental health expert in Princeton, New Jersey. She's on the faculty of the Academy of Integrative Health and Medicine, where she created and manages the environmental medicine curriculum for medical colleges. Dr. Cohen is working to educate and empower the next generation to make safer, smarter lifestyle choices through the creation of environmental health and prevention curricula for schools nationally. She's the author of Non-Toxic: Guide to Living Healthy in a Chemical World, Integrative Environmental Medicine, and her latest book, Detoxify: The Everyday Chemicals Harming Your Immune System and How to Defend Against Them. Her website, thesmarthuman.com. Dr. Cowan, thank you so much for joining us on Mission Evolution.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, there's a long list of credentials that you have, and I didn't even have time to read all of them. So, with all of those, what brought you to environmental health, and how did you get involved in this topic and area of medicine?
Yeah, well, again, thank you for having me. This conversation of how do I get into this, I feel that it came at in a very organic way, in a way that I wasn't expecting. So to begin with, it really started with the sickness of my golden retriever, my dog, being ill about 15 or so years ago. And I was a young mom. I just started rheumatology practice. And I had a puppy that was about 4.5 years of age who got really sick. He ended up getting jaundiced and was discovered that he had autoimmune hepatitis, which is when the animal's body, or humans for their autoimmune diseases, attack themselves. In his case, his liver. And it was really shocking. I mean, his liver was very tiny, and he really didn't have much long to live. And what was so interesting is I'm an autoimmune disease specialist for humans as a rheumatologist practicing 20 years. And so it came to me as a shock that my firstborn was sick. And I started to explore maybe how he got this way, because it's not usual for dogs, or even specifically this breed of golden retriever. I started looking at his air quality. I started looking at his drinking water, whether there were contamination issues from living in New Jersey on a farm. I looked at the toy he, sucked on, this plastic toy round the clock. I thought about his dog food and his, flea and tick collar medication. So I really was looking at what exposures could have affected his body and triggered an immune system reaction such as this. And the more I looked into his potential risks and, associations with his health, I started to uncover this unbelievable amount of information on the lack of regulation for chemicals in all of the products that humans love. And it really opened my eyes. And it took about 7 to 10 years from that point on to really build an understanding of things that I didn't learn in medical school, by the way, on how many of these exposures from air, from cosmetics, personal care products, textiles, drinking water can really affect human health. And so if my dog, had lived a long but relatively long golden retriever life, 10, 13 years, I really probably would not be doing the work that I'm doing. So it was really, a sad story, but certainly led the way to so much, educational work that I'm very proud of. So I hat tip and tribute all my work to this beautiful golden retriever, Truxton.
So, did you ever find out what exactly had impacted him?
No, it's a great question. At that time, I had not even tiptoed into the world of how chemicals affect human health. It was really coming from my heart and just trying to find a source. We never did, any type of autopsy. It wasn't at that point in my understanding. But now, having gone through almost 15, almost 20 years of research for textbooks and creating curriculum for programs, I have now come to understand that what likely had something to do with his immune system disorder, his triggering, was likely to be perhaps the constant sucking on a plastic toy, round the clock mucous membrane exposure, and the potential risk of those chemicals. So getting absorbed at such a constant rate, and particularly even you could argue in humans as well, this vulnerable period of development, even for a young dog.
So the typical golden, right? They always have to
Yeah.
have something in their mouth.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
are there toys now that don't have the toxic plastic in them? Dog toys
There
and whatnot?
Yeah, there's no regulation on this market. I mean, and even with human products. I mean, there's literally no regulation in the human market, so it's hard to argue that there's oversight or required testing for manufacturing for chemicals. It just doesn't exist. Are there companies that are trying to get it right and trying to limit some of the more known toxic chemicals that have been studied well to be problematic? Yeah, I do think there are companies that are doing that. And I certainly now are much more vigilant with I have a cat and a dog now. And of course, I have young humans living around me. So we are reading ingredients, we're researching companies, we're really doing our due diligence and vetting. And that's what I teach people and students how to do that themselves in the human markets more so than even the animal markets.
So we're going to get much deeper into this in the upcoming segments. But is there a way? I mean, or are we stuck? Is there a way to avoid these things, or are we just bombarded and can't get away from it?
Yeah, my work is all about the what to do. I don't live in a world where we're not empowered. I see solutions everywhere, even though these are difficult issues. And not only do I see solutions, I research the solutions. So I understand studies that when, say for instance, a family or a group of people are put on USDA organic diets, whether or not that actually lowers their exposures and their body burden of those pesticide chemicals that are linked to health conditions. Does it mean that they're going to change their personal risk of developing diseases that are associated with those pesticides that they now removed? Not entirely, because whether we develop any illness is a dance between our genetics and our lifestyle and our exposures. But what I try to kind of let people understand is that we have control over our lifestyle and the exposures to a large degree that affect our bodies, that get into us through skin, through ingestion, through inhalation, through intravaginal exposures with feminine care products. And so, if we can control two out of those three things, and we can't necessarily change our genetics, like you can't change your in laws, this is how you feel empowered, because there are really excellent studies showing that removal or not even bringing some of these chemicals into our homes, which make their way into our bodies, we are lowering the risk of developing a whole host of health conditions.
I know. I was as I was preparing our episode together. What came to my mind was my little sister, who's 12 years younger than I am. My mother fed her with those colored plastic bottles
Mhm.
and the rubber nipples, and this was clear back in the 60s. Um, and I wonder what impact that has, and have they looked into that at this point for our children today?
Well, I can assure you that plastic baby bottles, since 2012, due to the work of my co-author Frederick von Saal for two textbooks, he helped get that removed. Bisphenol A, which is one particular chemical, one phenol chemical that was associated with hormone changes, hormone disruption. We call them endocrine disrupting chemicals. And BPA, many people might have heard of that before, was implicated in causing, or I should say, associated with a lot of changes in hormone messaging. And that is why it was taken out of plastic baby bottles in the United States that are manufactured here. That being said, there are a variety of other. What we call regrettable substitutions, which are chemicals that were created to take the place of BPA's function and ease of use. So there's BPS, BPF, and a variety of other bisphenols that are allowed to be in a lot of plastics. So even though you're describing the 1960s, I'll tell you, not much has changed in terms of the potential risk because, again, there's no required safety testing for toxicity, particularly in vulnerable populations like infants, right, who have immature detoxification systems and are still growing and have brain development, body development. But there's really very little to no regulation. And so the solution, which I'm always looking for solutions, is that we can now use glass bottles, which are really available everywhere. And, I have my own regrets. When my kids were little, we had the drop in plastic containers into plastic bottles. So, you could get away with these like squishy plastic drop ins. I didn't know better, and when you don't know better, you can't always do better. So I don't look back with regret. I look back in with empowerment. I mean, forward with empowerment, and I think that that's the way we should kind of keep giving ourselves this, positive reinforcement for good change. But again, there's very little that's regulated, so it's more about empowering the individual. And I've always said that we have to do this now. We have no time to wait. And here are the instructions on how to do these very simple changes.
Well, it sounds very empowering because I know a lot of us feel like we're victim of circumstance here. It is time for us to take a station break. Dr. Cowan and I will return very shortly, so don't you go away. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Are you toxic? With us this hour discussing toxins found in our environment is Dr. Aly Cohen. Dr. Cohen is the author of Detoxify, the Everyday Chemicals and How to Defend Against Them. Dr. Cowan, we were starting to get into the plastics and whatnot that come into our bodies through our environment and things that we use. Um, and if we go back to the baby with the baby bottle, you say it's an endocrine disruptor. Does that possibly then contribute later in life to reproductive cancer?
Yeah, so just to begin with, we have a huge body of evidence on how many chemicals in our environment, not just those in plastics, but chemicals that create grease proof surfaces and stain guard chemicals, a lot of industrial solvents, even chemicals like phthalates, which are used to create perfumes and extend the life of those odors and those perfumes. So we have over 95,000 chemicals in the US commercial market. There's about 350,000 worldwide. And so that's a lot of chemicals to be tested individually. But what we know from a vast majority of them is that they do have potential risks to the human hormone systems of our bodies, which it makes them endocrine disrupting chemicals by definition, because they can disrupt a variety of mechanisms that hormones work to communicate around the body to manage insulin, which is a hormone for sugar metabolism and creation management, fertility, and growth and development, even bone building and bone strength is hormone regulated. Thyroid is hormone regulated, and certain cancers, of course, that are hormone dependent, like endometrial, prostate, testosterone, thyroid, have effects from hormones that circulate throughout the body. So these chemicals can disrupt the proper messaging and the function. That being said, they can also affect immune system components because our immune system is not siloed or separate from our endocrine system. They work and have lots of crosstalk. So, when it comes to exposure, number one, it's not just what we're exposed to, it's also the vulnerable periods of development that also pose a little bit greater risk. Time periods when hormones are actively being created and actively being broken down, which is typically in utero as a fetus, certainly to create male and female brain development, as well as body features and genitalia. But then there's also young children, toddlers that are growing very rapidly. That's another time period with lots of hormone flux Then you have the teenage years, which I can attest to with two teenage boys, that they are all over the place and lots of emotion running high. That's another very strong hormonal period. Then we also have, again, pregnancy, when a mother becomes pregnant, or even men to some degree when they're becoming, when they're fertile. And then even menopause is a time for great hormone flux. These vulnerable periods tend to have potentially more effects from these environmental chemicals because of that influx or flux of hormone creation and breakdown. Um,
Do you think
yeah.
that the overload of chemicals, and it builds up in our body, I expect, do you think that that has anything to do with the increase in gender confusion that we're seeing?
Well, I want to, that's a very sensitive topic.
Yes, it
I
is.
will say that the people who really do the research on this, like Dr. Shauna Swan, who wrote a book called Countdown, that was an excellent, description, academic, really, I thought, well done work that had a chapter in there talking about sort of this fluidity of gender. There is certainly science to support that there are blocking of androgens, male hormones in utero from these phthalate exposures, the phthalates coming from plastic chemicals, industrial chemicals, perfumes. So I can't tell you with hard fact and science that there's ever a cause and effect, especially when it comes to humans who have so many confounders between their diet and their water and their air and their stress and childhood stress. But I will say that there is certainly evidence to show that disruption of hormones can potentially affect a variety of outcomes in utero,
So,
including congenital issues with male testes, anogenital distance, which is usually measured. So there's a lot that can be measured, but dimorphic brain changes into a male or female brain, that also has potential exposure issues as well.
so that's exposure inner utero based on what the mother is
Correct.
consuming, and I assume that it crosses the placental wall and gets into the child. These chemicals. Do these chemicals build up in our system and remain in our system to cause problems down the road?
That's a great question. So chemicals have all different properties of their own. They have what's called a half-life. Many of these chemicals that are studied, which means that 50% of the breakdown happens over a certain period that's designated, and then maybe another 50% over another period. So, for as an example, bisphenol A, which is one of the classic endocrine disrupting chemicals, BPA, which lines every canned food that we know of, is also part of setting ink on receipts and thermal paper. There's lots of places that BPA is used, not just being taken out of baby bottles, plastic baby bottles, as I mentioned. It is in a variety of other products, thousands and thousands of products. BPA has a half life of 6 to 8 hours on average in the human body, which means it takes about 6 to 8 hours for 50% of it to break down, and then another 6 to 8 hours for another 50%. So you can see that over the course of several days, you can wash out that exposure and break it down, which is wonderful. And that actually bodes well to behavioral choices and changes, that if you decide to stop having as much canned foods where BPA is mostly ingested through the foods and drinks and sodas that we love in cans, then you will often, and actually studies show this, your BPA levels will dramatically drop if you change that behavior. And so not every chemical has a half-life that's short. There's also, non-stick and perfluoralkyls or PFAS chemicals that we know last a lot longer in our environment and in our bodies. So it's a matter of understanding where these chemicals are coming from and making simple changes behaviorally and with smart product choices to reduce those exposures from getting into our bodies.
So it sounds like when you talk about how many chemicals are in our world,
Mhm.
okay, what about the combination? I mean, how
Yeah.
do we talk about combining medications, and you can't hardly study for that. But what about combining chemicals? Does that make things worse?
Yeah, that's a great question, Gwilda. I mean, mixture studies is what they're called, is where we have academic centers, of course, not manufacturers. They don't do these studies. They don't have to, they're not required to. In Europe, we actually have the EU, which has a much more regulated and stringent form of testing than the United States. That's something that we should all know about. In fact, some companies, big companies, will formulate products and personal care products, for instance, shampoo, conditioner for the US market, but won't, but have an entirely different formulation for European markets, which is unbelievable. But when we have mixtures, certainly it's additive, just like you said with medications. When medications are studied, they're studied as individual medications in terms of their use, their purpose, their side effects, but we never really think about multiple medicines. Well, the same is true, as you mentioned, for environmental chemicals. It just adds more weight to the behavioral changes because the more easy swaps to make, the less likely those mixtures will be in our bodies and potentially could synergize to cause more problems. That's for sure.
So I have to go backwards a little bit. You're saying how some of the personal care products will make a formula for the United States and then they'll make a totally different formula for Europe. Why? Why don't they just make the better formula for the US as well?
It's a great question. It has a lot to do with cost and markets that are already, why change something if they don't have to put the money into doing so? I mean, really, money speaks, right? So if there was regulatory oversight and requirements, that would be something that these companies would have to reformulate. I'll give you an example. Flame retardant chemicals from the 1970s in the US were really designed to be in, home furnishings, particularly couches, to prevent a cigarette from falling on the couch and allowing 12 extra seconds, literally 12 extra seconds on that material to get out of the house. There was no requirement to change the formulation of the cigarette. That is a whole thing that was set up by, we know this from the Chicago Tribune, Pulitzer Prize winning stories to prevent, if we changed the formulation of the cigarettes, it would have prevented dousing, the entire couch industry in the 70s with, toxic brominated chemicals that are really harmful to the thyroid and a bunch of other health related issues. In 2013, however, fortunately, there was a reversal on the requirement to have any of those chemicals that are toxic in couches. And it's called TB 117 2013, which is actually now on labels for couches that do not have those flame retardant chemicals. So we had a reversal. It was voluntary by the manufacturing companies of these couches. And it has taken effect because the market has asked for it, that people are well aware from the great reporting. And so therefore, even though it wasn't required, it has been moving the market towards flame retardant free furniture. Um, and so that's been helpful. But again, people can just look at the label and understand which couches from which manufacturers have moved towards reducing those exposure chemicals.
It sounds like it falls back on us. If we vote with our dollar, if you will, that's going to bring about more change than any of the studies or regulations. Is that
Yeah,
what we're
well,
looking at?
just the beauty industry is one prime example, right? People who want cleaner products, particularly the beauty products in the beauty industry, are really buying and moving the market with their dollars. In other words, the tipping point of understanding that chemicals do potentially cause health issues has made people more conscientious. And I will say, having practiced medicine and still practicing medicine, that because we're getting sicker, because we
There's
have
that.
an epidemic, and I can speak to the literature on this as well as my clinical practice, we have an epidemic of health
Well,
conditions, chronic
we're
health conditions.
we're going to have to pick up on that epidemic on the other
Yeah,
side of a station
sure.
identifier. Dr. Cowan and I will be right back to continue our discussion. You stay right there. This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. Why are so many people sick? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. With us discussing toxic chemicals and human health is Dr. Aly Cohen. Her website, thesmarthuman.com. Dr. Cowan, we were just, as we came in, leaving the last segment, you had started talking about people are getting sicker. And, it's kind of hard not to look around you and see that that's the case. I mean, even if you just look at the physical condition of our youth, it's like obesity and the dull eye look and all this. And I think back to the elders. So, say, for instance, my father, who was born in 1915, he lived a good long life, even though towards the end of his life he was eating TV dinners.
Yeah.
Okay. But he grew up in an era that didn't have all these chemicals. How does that impact us? Is it really hit us worse when we're younger? Why is everybody getting sick now?
Yeah, we're starting at a much younger age with chemicals that, say, your father didn't experience until later in life when his genetics, so to speak, were sort of laid down and his future risk of health conditions was laid down. We understand now that in utero exposures, believe it or not, can have effects lifelong in terms of their health risks. And we can also now say that generations beyond an exposure can actually be affected almost genetically to some degree. So instead of layering that on as more fear and less, and creating more resistance, I really just try to talk to, folks about getting your own body as clean as possible before potentially moving on to having future children, so that we can keep making our bodies cleaner as vessels when we have children.
So
The idea, yeah.
I want to back up just a little bit to something that you said. Oh, that does it actually cause genetic damage that then is passed on?
Yes, it's true that there are small changes in what's called our epigenome, which is the proteins that sit on our genes and allow those genes to be expressed in one way or another. We can control the genes which is through lifestyle and toxin reduction, we can control those proteins and then therefore affect whether genes that have disease get expressed. So there's absolutely a positive approach to managing our future health risks even generations later by creating healthier lifestyle changes now.
I
Yes.
understand that epigenetics, we do have a lot more control over it than what was originally thought. How do we control that exactly?
So we know from specific studies, I'll give you an example of, green leafy vegetables, which have folic acid or vitamin B9. We know that that particular substance, that vitamin, that nutrient is actually able to offset some of the exposure related epigenetic changes from BPA. We know, for instance, that having an appropriate amount of iodine in your daily diet, which is often now, by the way, not available in sea salts, or Himalayan or Celtic. We don't have iodine. We don't have it in bread where people don't eat a lot of bread. We are sort of diminished in our intake of iodine, but iodine is critically important as a daily nutrient to be protective to our thyroid gland. It sits in there and it really offsets some of the environmental chemicals that we may not be able to control, like food washes and such. So the idea that there's a variety of nutrient food based minerals and vitamins that have been shown to offset some of the harm that we have now created in our lives from just living in modern day times. It gives us more power to, again, offset our potential health and harmful health risks. So I'm really encouraging people to, consider organic, at least in the United States. The USDA organic system, although not perfect, is really the only system we have that mitigates exposures through pesticides and fertilizer chemicals and genetically modified ingredients, artificial colors, preservatives, flavorings. And now we have organic frozen foods that not only have the benefit of reduced exposures through chemicals in food we eat, but when food is flash frozen, it actually maintains all of its nutrient value. Instead of traveling in a food system that could take days, weeks, or months to get to your supermarket, or potentially, has, is frozen at low temperature and such. So the idea is that you get a win-win when you have frozen USDA organics, as long as you switch out of plastic and put it into glass and stainless steel for heating, not steam bags, which are, again, adding more potential plastic chemicals to the food that's cooking inside.
What about if you're already sick? Okay. And that's when most people start to pay attention. Okay, I'm already sick. I've got a cancer diagnosis. I've got a Hashimoto's diagnosis for my thyroid, etc. What steps are there steps that we can take that will turn it around?
Absolutely. And having worked in this area for 20 years as an integrative medicine physician, as a rheumatologist, and understanding the values of medications as well, and now understanding the environmental health components, there's no doubt that when we change our lifestyle, which includes removing many of those chemicals that trigger the immune system, because they're not just hormone sensitive chemicals, they are immune system effects. Our immune system cells, the primitive ancient anthropologic cells that have kept us beautifully healthy through infection and a variety of reasons we need that immune system to work so nicely have receptors for hormones. So we know that there's interconnection because the chemicals that act like hormones can stimulate the immune system. So the long story short is that no matter how their effects on the human body, we want to start by going upstream to removing them from our bodies to reduce the potential for disease flares in rheumatoid and lupus, Crohn's, multiple sclerosis. We now know that when you fix some of that exposure issue, including, the gut microbiome work, and preventing the gut from being exposed through diet and drinking water, you are actually making your immune system stronger. And when that strong immune system is healthier, you will have less flares. So for those who are sick, and I obviously deal with people who have known diagnoses and are managing their chronic illness, there is no doubt that a reduction in symptoms can occur from making lifestyle changes to get these immune and hormone triggers out of our bodies.
Can that also add to longevity, regardless of what your diagnosis is?
Well, longevity to me is really a matter of quality of life as well.
Of
And
course.
when you're living longer but living sicker, I'm not sure if that's as much value as living, reasonable but living strong. I mean, I guess it's all a matter of how you perceive life. We want to live with less illness, less visits to doctors, less medications that they themselves may be helpful for the diseases they were designed for, but also potentially have side effect risks. So the idea is to, definitely work towards, cleaning up our bodies from every sort of exposure that's unnecessary or not required. As I was mentioning earlier, we're now seeing people at younger ages getting diseases we wouldn't expect. And also, those people are also having diseases that have, they have no family history. So
Hmm.
we know
Right.
that there is this kind of, exposure, certainly an exposure related risk to this problem. And, we've been living on this planet for millions of years. It's only been about 100 years since we've had these 95,000 chemicals in our lives. And that's
Just
a
about the
very,
time just
yeah.
about the time men decided that they had a better idea, right? Or
Yeah,
people
listen,
decided, yeah.
out of
So
the starting gate, we think we have good ideas, but we don't necessarily see the future and how these are going to play out.
many docs that I've had on the show tend to talk about inflammation and its part in disease. How much do chemicals play with inflammation? And if so, what's the operating system there?
Yeah, this is the source of a lot of my new research. Essentially, many of the chemicals that were deemed endocrine disruptors are also, again, relating to immune effects. And we are seeing this with, say, for instance, the PFAS chemicals, which there are now over 15,000 of those chemicals. They're also called forever chemicals because they are very hard to break down because of their structure. We know that, for instance, that group of chemicals reduces the ability of the human body to respond to vaccines and build an immune response. So that can play a role in the future if we're exposed to any type of, local disease or a pandemic, of course. But there's BPA or bisphenol A that has a variety of immune system effects as well that we're now discovering long after we discovered the hormone effects. So again, this inflammation concept is very broad and I know it's overwhelming, but we do walk around as modern day humans with a decent amount of inflammation from things that we can't always control. Even if you have the best diet and the cleanest water and the safest products, it's a matter of really doing the best you can under the circumstances that you're living within. And I think that's really important to understand. You can't always be perfect, but the best you can do can also help to reduce inflammation, not just for things that you don't feel and see, like a rash or, acute illness, but also for potential health risks like cancers and development of immune disorders down the line.
Is there location specific chemicals? In other words, based on where we live, is it certain things you'd look for where you wouldn't if you lived someplace else?
Yeah, that's a great question. It turns out that even some of the cleanest places on earth have exposures that you would never think about. There was, a book I remember reading about someone who lived in the backwoods of Maine who was actually tested for chemicals and was found to have quite a few that you wouldn't expect living in the backwoods of Maine away from mainstream society. But what it also says is that, even though we're exposed and there's really not any perfect place to live, really the perfection, I shouldn't say perfection, the progress comes from taking the space that you live within and doing much better than perhaps even a place you thought was pristine and let your guard down. So, for instance, in your own home is a wonderful place to start because you have control of that space. You can decide not to bring in cosmetics and personal care products or cleaning products that have chemicals by vetting them on very reasonable websites that do this for a living and are very good at it. And
Well,
that's what I
it's
like is evergreen sites that where people can really look up information that's literally vetted and evidence based.
well,
Um,
it is time for us to take yet another station break. Please stay with us as Dr. Cowan and I continue to explore healthy living in a toxic world. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. We're continuing our discussion with Dr. Aly Cowen. Her website, thesmarthuman.com. Dr. Cowen, let's talk about water. Even the way we purify our water is up for question as of late. How many of the toxins and the chemicals and whatnot are in our drinking water?
So, great question again. So, drinking water has become, over the last 15 years, of all the problems that I research and study and share with people, water has really become the biggest issue for me. I think it's the most underrated, underevaluated, underappreciated source of contamination and contributor of human health conditions in modern day times. And the reason I say that is because what I thought was so overseen and regulated, again, surprise, surprise, really has not been updated in terms of the laws in at least 60 years under, say, for instance, the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1976 in the United States. That's 1976. We've had 91 chemicals monitored since that time, and none have been added except for the perfluoroalkyls PFAS, which was just recently announced in terms of some regulation on just six of the 15,000 PFAS chemicals
Oh
that
my
are now.
goodness.
So that's not even going to take place for several years. So the idea is that we have an outdated regulatory system. We have wastewater treatment plants that serve 85% of the US population with the treatment plants. The other 15% is well water and local wells, which have some of their own issues in terms of lack of regulation. And so, what it comes down to, again, is we have a system that we rely on for safety that is not really doing enough in terms of prevention of disease. Um,
I was at one point visiting with a lady who was one of the experts on GRD and water, wastewater, and that sort of thing. And she told me that there's a known carcinogen created when you mix organic material with chlorine. Okay. And most of our water systems are still using chlorine to purify. And then the other thing I'd like to talk about is so, okay, great. So then we get RO water. But doesn't that leach all the chemicals out and doesn't that have its own problems?
So, I will argue up, down, left, and right that any filtration is better than no filtration. So let's pat ourselves on the back for anything that require, whether it's a pitcher that uses a carbon block, which is limited but still good. It's better than nothing versus a refrigerator, which is carbon block. There's all sorts of mechanisms. But I will say that now that we have very cost effective vetted, reasonable reverse osmosis water filter systems that can be put in for $150 by a plumber that costs $275. They can be done under your kitchen sink. You don't necessarily need a whole house water filter for 6, 7, 10 grand. I actually discourage that because you can always get a shower head that has a carbon block for $20. And other than that, what else do you need a whole house filter for? So when you get it in your home, in your kitchen, I have one here in my office, it's really serving for, drinking water, cooking water, and it's remarkably inexpensive now. I will say that my father, who's a nephrologist, who's 85 and still practicing, in the 70s, when dialysis was actually brought to the consumer market for the first time ever, they required reverse osmosis, federally cleaned reverse osmosis water back then, huge tanks, which they still have. We now have cost efficient, cost non prohibitive systems that can do the same thing in our homes. And that's the point, Gwilda, is that if you have wells that are a problem, which they all potentially are, and you have municipal tap water, which varies from town to town in terms of floods or exposures, manufacturing, sewage. It doesn't almost matter where it comes from, chlorine, fluoride, or whatever, you're going to clean it at the point of use, which is in your home at the tap. And so that's why, I really push people to think about reverse osmosis because the pricing has come down so dramatically. You really want to do your research, make sure it's not outsourced to other countries, that the actual material, which is, very, very small pores, is catching things by size. So in the original days of RO, it was to catch infections, right, for dialysis patients who are immune compromised. So it was single celled organisms like viruses and bacteria. Those are even smaller than the compounds we now use for solvents and industrial chemicals. So we really have the infrastructure to do better with our drinking water at a much lower cost than ever was. So
So
that's
if we do that, okay, again, does it remove the chemicals from our water, and do you suggest supplementing to compensate?
yeah, so it's going to vary by local towns. Every
I'm sorry, I
town
meant
has.
minerals. Did I say minerals?
Yeah, I understood what you said, but I'll
Okay.
clarify that as well. But a great question. So, every town, every water system, which you can look up to see what are the problems with the water in your town. There are certain ways to do that. You get an annual water report. Of course, there's only once a year, but there's lots of ways to figure out if you have problems. But let's just assume every single city has some type of contamination problem, no doubt. um, Reverse osmosis is able to do a very good job, the best that we have available on the market. Okay, so that's what we have as consumers. It's never going to be perfect, but it's going to be far stronger than, say, carbon block, which is not as effective in certain groups of chemicals by far. What we do know is that we don't get nutrition from water. Water is not the source of nutrition. What we have to understand is that when you take away chemicals, you have to take everything out, baby with the bathwater, no matter what, because it's by size. And so it's not going to know, your system's not going to necessarily know a mineral or, potassium or anything in your water, magnesium, or anything that you might deem healthy versus lead, mercury, phthalates, PFAS chemicals. So it's all coming out by size. That being said, have a wonderful glass of reverse osmosis water with a salad or with a healthy meal. Maybe it's organic. Maybe you're having snacks that are healthy and have minerals, but you don't necessarily need any nutritional value from water. And that's the only way we can get clean water, is to remove everything that potentially could be harmful. Now, you can add those minerals back in if you're so inclined, but there's nothing nutritionally required as a human being that needs that back at that moment.
Well, Dr. Cowan, it's that time in the show, and I get to ask you, what's your mission?
What's my mission? Well, my mission is, I hope to help people live healthier and longer with great quality of life by understanding the world that we now find ourselves in. And it's my mission to really keep people healthy into the future, with their successive generations as well. So, yeah, that's it. It's my life's work. And thanks to my dog Truxton, I'm on that path, I hope.
Well, bless your golden.
I know,
So,
right?
is there any, I hate to sound hopeless, but is there any hope of turning this around so our world is not so toxic for future generations?
With every message that I give on protecting your body, I always tend to put a sustainability message, because the world we create through bottled, single-use plastics, and the fashion industry with the dye runoff, and, mounds and mounds of trash around the world and the ocean. All of this is connected. We are circular in terms of what goes into our water, then comes back into our bodies, and likewise. So, it's not always effective just to go with just human health without thinking about planetary health. I think we have to really understand the interconnections so that we can make dents in both. And it's very possible with the choices that we make. Just even carrying your own stainless steel or glass water bottle and filling up at home reduces plastic use into the environment dramatically, but also the microplastics and the chemicals that we may absorb. So there's lots of good that can be done from simple choices that affect both human health risk and also, save our planet, or at least extend, the beauty and life of our planet as long as we can, of course.
Well, it's like water. Again, we started this segment with water. There's all these you go to the filling station and there's all these choices of water that are supposed to be healthy, and you feel like you're doing yourself a favor by drinking the bottled water. But what about the bottles, and what does that do to the water?
Yeah, I do a lot of, kind of posting in airports, and I kind of give real-time information about my choices and what I'm thinking through. And I'll give you an example. In an airport, when you're traveling, you can't always bring your water across security, of course. You can bring your stainless steel bottle, which is great, and empty it out and then use it when you get to your destination or even in the airports. But when you're in the airport, it's interesting. We have a plethora of choices of bottled water. And no, we're not always going to make a dent on the bottled water issue because there's not a lot of glass bottles anymore. Unfortunately, companies have really reduced that, production. But water bottles, if you look at drinking water and you can see in the United States, it says ingredients, you can see how that water is cleaned. No one ever bothers to look. We all think water's the same. But when you see ingredients and it says cleaned by distillation, which is just raising temperature to high levels, that's not necessarily going to keep out chemicals. It's just going to get rid of infection risk, or cleaned by reverse osmosis, or ozonated, or that kind of thing. You have choices even with a whole choice of, a bunch of water bottles and sources of drinking water there. So, we have more choices than we think. We just probably didn't always pay attention. I didn't, and that's what I'm trying to make people aware of, that we have a lot more choices to help our bodies be healthier.
So we have a lot of choices, and what choices we make dictates our future health as well as that of the planet.
Correct.
Well, unfortunately, we are totally out of time in this show. Dr. Cohen, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Our guest this hour has been Dr. Aly Cowen, the author of Non-Toxic: Guide to Living Healthy in a Chemical World, Integrative Environmental Medicine, and her latest book, Detoxify: The Everyday Chemicals Harming Your Immune System and How to Defend Against Them. To find out more about Dr. Cowan, where you can find her books and all she has to offer, visit her website, thesmarthuman.com. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka. For more information or to enjoy our past archived episodes, visit www.missionevolution.org. But please be sure to join us right here next time. This mission will continue, bringing information, resources, and support to our rapidly evolving world.